So good morning, everyone. I'd like to personally welcome all of you and those online for joining us for the Children's Mental Health Learning Series. It's probably very obvious to all of you who've engaged in this conversation or come here from near and far that to effectively support children, we have an obligation and a moral imperative to educate ourselves about the leading practices and understanding the diagnosis and the circumstances that children and families find themselves in. When we do that, we are better able to obviously support them in their schools and their communities with the programs and services that we offer and deliver, and probably, and most importantly, help support their optimal development in their family and in their communities. We know, and hopefully we know, and we learn through expert advice and consultation and feedback, research, evaluation from people like Evelyn, that by effectively supporting children, particularly in their early years, we help to build on their strengths, maximize their potential, help them navigate through their formative years, and most importantly, encourage good decision making and support their optimal development, which obviously has far-reaching impacts into their future. The learning series that you're all participating in today is an initiative of the Government of Alberta in collaboration with the experts that, like Evelyn, who've kindly offered their assistance to help us learn. And it's in response to many requests from staff and others who have said, we need to understand and take up the challenge of knowing about those kinds of circumstances that impact kids and families that we're working with. These series are designed as short, obviously awareness building sessions for human services staff, foster parents, caregivers, agency providers, and others who have an interest in the topics that we have on the series. As Maureen had indicated, this is the third session, and Evelyn's focus today, as I understand it, will be on the core story of development, which is a fundamental, critical, foundational conversation that we should all know about in terms of serving kids and their families. Evelyn's session will look at how infants use the caregiver to regulate their response to threatening or frightening events, and how trauma can be transmitted from the caregiver or parent to the child. I have the privilege of introducing Evelyn today. Evelyn is a social worker and a 0 to 3 fellow. And I had to ask about, Maureen and I had to ask about what that is, and perhaps Evelyn can expound on that, but it is quite a prestigious and well-earned honor that has been bestowed or given to Evelyn from her work in the early childhood developmental area. And she has devoted her career to high-risk children and families. For the last decade, she has been providing early childhood mental health training and consultation to child welfare workers, lawyers, judges, and other service providers throughout Canada and the United States. Evelyn has authored papers on the needs of vulnerable infants and toddlers for a variety of publications. She is currently in private practice in Calgary, I believe, specializing in the needs of infants and toddlers that have been exposed to maltreatment, family conflict, and domestic violence. We are very fortunate to have Evelyn as a partner and an educator for us today. Welcome, Evelyn.
I should probably just clarify, 0 to 3 fellowship wasn't bestowed by the president exactly. It was a learning opportunity that I was able to engage in with the 0 to 3 organization in the States, and they have a wonderful website. You should go and have a look at it. It is just 0to3.org, I believe. And it's a terrific website, but they did give me an opportunity to do some in-depth learning with them, which I did a few years ago, and hence the fellowship designation. Anyway, So, now this is a part 2 of a two-part lecture that I did. The first part, I talked about the core story. I didn't know how many people attending today were there for the first lecture, so I just want to briefly review some of what I talked about the last time we met. And that was basically describing this core story of how children come to be who they are, how they develop. And the story begins with what is child development, and I always say that's the baby's job. The baby's got a job to do, and we're going to talk about the specifics of that job in a minute. How it happens. Child development happens in the context of relationships. Children cannot develop properly without the support of caring adults. So child development happens with a relationship. And it happens through the serve and return. Remember we talked about this last time, the interactions, the minute little back and forth that goes on. The baby initiates or serves a cue, and the parent responds or returns that cue with a response. How is it getting derailed? We talked about toxic stress, the stress of a breakdown in that parent-child relationship will derail the child's development. And we're going to talk a little bit more today about what does it mean for the children who've been traumatized that we are working with, or their parents. And I'm going to start with a little video. This is available through the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. They posted this on their website. It just came out a couple of months ago, and I believe it's called Building a Better Brain. We talked about the last time in about 5 minutes, so here we go.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, Air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
That particular video, I think, covers in about a 5-minute span what I spent 90 minutes talking about the last time we got together. I wish I'd seen it first, but anyway. And that is available from the Alberta Family Wellness website if you're interested. The main message then that we're giving around this core story is that relationships are the active ingredient in child development. They are the secret sauce that makes it all work. And as Yuri Bronfenbrenner said, somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That is number one, first, last, and always. Someone has to be crazy about that kid. So when I'm asked to consult or get involved in complex, sometimes very challenging family situations, there's a lot of people involved, there's a lot of factors to consider. My first question always is, who is crazy about that kid? And what can we do to protect that relationship? Because that is the best chance we can give a child who is otherwise faced with a lot of adversity, is to put them in the hands of someone who is crazy about them. So, as I said, we're explaining child development. The first place we begin is, what is the child's job? I have found this is a good way to frame it for families, to say your baby has a job to do and they need your help to do it. They can't do it on their own. They need a relationship to do it in. So the baby's job comes in 3 parts. The part 1 is they need to learn how to engage in a close emotional tie. They need to attach. They need to learn about emotional intimacy. And babies start doing that right from the beginning, as we talked about the last time. So that's job 1. The second part of their job is what we all think about when we think about child development. They need to learn to explore and learn about their environment. Walking, talking, sitting, standing, language. All of that is happening in those first few years of life. And there's a third part of the job, and this is where many traumatized children, where we really see the impact of trauma on children, is the third part of their job is to learn how to regulate their attention, their emotions, and their behavior. And children who don't have secure, solid, reliable, nurturing relationships have a hard time learning how to regulate their emotions, their attention, and their behavior. And that is a major misunderstanding for children who are traumatized, is that we expect a lot of them that they are unable to produce in the way of appropriate behavior because they haven't had that opportunity to engage in an emotionally caring, nurturing, loving relationship. They haven't had the serve and return occurring over the course of their infancy and early childhood, and very often it shows up in this dysregulation or this inability to manage their emotions, constrain their behavior, and stay focused the way we would expect them to. So I think I showed you this picture before. This is Andy Maltzoff, who is a researcher in the States, playing with a very tiny little baby. And you can see this little one very imitative, very responsive to what Andy is doing. Andy is responding, and the baby's responding back. The serve and return you can see happening there. That disappears, that imitative instinct, after a little while, and then it comes back in a more purposeful way, a more conscious imitation later on. And babies, I believe, the theory is that the reason infants have hung on to this imitative instinct throughout the millennia is probably because it engaged a caregiver. It engaged adults with them and probably allowed them to survive. So you think the baby, you're entertaining the baby? No, the baby is actually entertaining you. The baby is engaging you in that close emotional tie. They start that right at birth. By about 1 year of age, it's pretty well established. Babies show strong preferences for familiar people by about 1 year. So what is derailing development? We talked about this again, stress. Stress is derailing development for young children. This is a summary from a lecture by Matthew Hill on stress and its impact on child development. It is available for you to watch in its entirety on the Alberta Family Wellness website. And if you just use the search term Matthew Hill, you will come to 2 lectures where he discusses the impact of stress on development. And he talks about the stress response being this highly integrated repertoire of responses that includes the secretion of stress hormones, the mobilization of energy, there's a surge of glucose into the bloodstream, there's an increase in your heart and blood pressure that happens when the stress response is triggered. The immune system and inflammatory response are modified to prepare for a threat. And there's a redirection of blood to the brain so that you can think more quickly and away from digestion, which the body considers unnecessary in a threat situation. There's a suppression of higher order thinking, so you're not that thoughtful when you're under a lot of stress. You tend to be more impulsive. And there's also suppression of motivation for rewards. So you tend to find things less rewarding when you're under stress than you might otherwise. And this has implications for parenting, because one of the things we're learning is that parents who've had a lot of trauma don't get as much of a reward from interactions with their babies. So they don't find their babies as rewarding as other parents do. And often we treat that like a moral failure on the part of the parents, but really it's an artifact of trauma. What Matthew says, and many other people who are familiar with this research, is that your stress response, we all have one, even tiny, tiny infants have a fully functioning stress response. It's beautifully designed for one-off, one-time events. So it's meant for handling predators. And we have evolved that way. So we're very good when we're under a direct threat from a predator. Unfortunately, most of the stress that children and families are experiencing comes in the form of social stress, and often it's chronic stress. So it's a daily activation of this stress response. You can see how damaging it would be to the body and to the brain if you're constantly secreting these stress hormones, which, by the way, are toxic to the developing brain. And when the brain is bathed in stress hormones during critical periods of development, it has a particularly damaging and long-term effect. And you can see that if you're constantly activating the stress response that increases your heart rate and your blood pressure, how over time you're going to have long-term health consequences of that. And indeed, there is research showing that early adversity is linked to long-term health outcomes across a variety of disease categories, including heart and other high blood pressure. All of those things can be connected to early adverse experiences. And if you're interested in learning more about that, the Center for Disease Control, I believe, has a website on the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Events Study. Vincent Folletti was one of the main authors, and it's very interesting. They've put out a series of very interesting papers that are that have a lot of implications for those of us working with traumatized parents and children. So, toxic stress is uncontrollable, unpredictable, and pervasive. It's chronic, not one-time events. It involves persistently elevating the stress response. It's highly individual, so it's often difficult to say what will be toxic for one child or parent versus another, because a lot depends on how much support is available to the child in their environment. And it does involve this, what's called allostatic load, or I refer to it as just wear and tear on the body and the organs of and the brain included. So there's this long-term wear and tear effect. So this is how I try to explain it when I'm talking to a parent about stress and how it's impacting them and their children. Is you have normal stress, as they talked about in that little video clip. Then there's stress that's emotionally costly, perhaps. Something happens, the loss of a loved one, or a major event like a car accident or something like that. And it can be costly, but still manageable, because the child is surrounded by supportive, caring adults. Where it becomes toxic, it moves into that toxic category, is when it's long-term, pervasive, and there's no supportive, caring adult to support the child. There's a new paper out by the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. They have now produced a new paper on the science of neglect. I found it quite helpful. They're suggesting a different way of thinking about neglect than what I've seen in other publications. So they are suggesting that we think about neglect in terms of the lack of serve and return. And they define neglect along a continuum and looking at how much serve and return is available to the baby, as opposed to categorizing it according to medical neglect or educational neglect, which is more the traditional definitions of neglect that I've seen. So they refer to both this absence of caregiving responses, the lack of serve and return, and what they say in that paper, which I think is not really well understood, is that we are herding animals. We are meant to interact with our fellow man. We are meant to engage in these close emotional ties. Babies want to do that from the very beginning. And so these interactions, these serve and returns, are developmentally expected, and they are biologically required. When children do not have a partner, an attachment partner doing the serve and return, the absence of those signals will trigger the stress response. And what we're finding is these chronically neglected infants are actually chronically stressed. The problem for a baby who's been neglected is that they don't look terribly stressed. They can often look quite passive. And often I hear people say, he's such a good baby, he never cries, he's not a problem at all. I hear foster parents say that, parents will say that. Or the other thing I hear as they get a little bit older is, he's really independent, he's really good at playing by himself. That's not always a good sign when babies are too passive or too independent. Sometimes we want babies to put up a bit of a fuss when things aren't going well. We want to see them give us some good cues as to what they need and what they want. These little babies, when they've been chronically neglected, tend to shut down, and you often don't get very accurate cues as to what they need. So they look happy and they look content, but really they're in despair. So neglect does lead to this chronic activation of the stress response, and that's the other thing we find, is these babies don't look terribly stressed. But research is showing that when physiological measures of the stress response are done, they're actually quite highly stressed. So they look fine on the surface. I always think of what's that analogy about the duck. They look calm on the surface, but they're paddling like crazy underneath, and that's really what's happening to many of these traumatized children, is that they can appear calm on the surface, but their stress response is in full force. So the impact of neglect, and I'm focusing a little bit on neglect because, in my view, it's one of the most urgent problems in child protection and in mental health today. There is a tendency to think that neglect is less serious than other forms of maltreatment, but the research is proving that that is simply not so. In fact, neglect is more likely to lead to the need for medical intervention than physical abuse. So more children are seeking medical attention because of neglect than because of physical abuse. They're more likely to need more intensive medical intervention. And neglect is more likely to lead to serious mental health issues, more so even than sexual abuse. So I think we're all pretty good when it comes to physical and sexual abuse about sounding the alarm, bringing in the supports. We're not as good or as reactive, as responsive when children are chronically neglected. So we need to take it a little bit more seriously and understand it a little bit better. So I'm going to show you a little video clip. This is from a program called Nova's Secrets of the Brain. I showed you some of these clips before. This is a different part of the same program. And I call it Use It or Lose It, because what they're describing here is how the brain is expecting certain things to happen and how the brain can't develop properly if it doesn't get those serve and return experiences.
So you can imagine the first stage of brain wiring is kind of like solving the problem of connecting phones in New York to phones in Boston. Making sure that you're making connections between Boston and New York and not Boston and Washington, D.C. And that's all specified genetically. Now then there's a second phase of brain wiring. Let's say you want to place a phone call to your grandmother in New York. And you want that phone to ring, you know, on Park Avenue and 47th or whatever. And you don't want the phone to ring up at the Waldorf Astoria. Okay, how do you get that precise phone to ring? That's the second phase of brain wiring. If you place a phone call to your grandmother early in development, her phone will ring. But so will a lot of other phones. So there are a lot of connections that are made. If the connections are correct and being used, they get strengthened. If they're not being used, or they're only being used occasionally, they're lost. We could call it use it or lose it. So the fetal brain is really a dynamic structure that's constantly changing in response to this process of strengthening appropriate connections and pruning inappropriate connections. Getting the circuits all tuned up takes a long time. So it can't happen overnight because you have literally billions of connections.
Brain development in these early years is really impacted by the serve and return. And what happens for the infant brain is that it's building on this foundation, and always skills are begetting new skills. So if you don't have that sturdy foundation, as you build on top of it, you need more and more effort and work to help that child overcome early deficits. So I think I'm going to skip the next video and just go to assessment. So Andy, I just skipped one slide, if that's okay. You with me? Okay, good. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about assessment when I'm involved with these families where there's been a lot of history, lots of trauma, lots of concerns and issues. And I often find with many of these families, I'm going to guess you guys do too, that often there's stacks of information, like literally several feet thick files on some of these families. Often they're multi-generational. We know a lot about not only the child, but the child's parents and grandparents from their own experiences as children in care. And very often there's almost too much information. You can't possibly sort through it all and know how to make sense of it, especially if you're trying to figure out what to do, plan an intervention. So this is how I've figured out, or how I weigh through all of that data and try to focus on what is really important. What I've found is a nice paper by Mark Greenberg and some colleagues, and it's called Attachment and Psychopathology in Childhood, where he looks at the relationship between attachment and later pathological outcomes for children. And what he says, and I've found many other papers that are saying the same thing, it's not any one event that will tell the story of a child's development. Children can actually withstand quite a bit of adversity before they start really going off the rails developmentally. But what does seem to matter is the accumulation of risk factors. This is both good news and bad news story. It is the accumulation of risk factors that are starting to burden an individual child that will really begin to derail their development in one way or another. But the good news about it is that if we can interfere with any one of those risk factors, we can actually substantially improve outcomes for young children. even one risk factor, if we can eliminate or modify or suppress one risk factor, we can exponentially increase the prospects of a good outcome for that child. So I know that when we're thinking about the mental health of young children, we often think about therapy, play therapy, family therapy, individual therapy, psychotherapy, attachment therapy, and therapy can be good. It can be one intervention. But it's not always easily accessible, and if you live in an isolated or rural community, you often don't have easy availability for those experts who are trained. It's expensive to train for some of these interventions, but maybe there's some other area in terms of risks that you can have some impact on. So we look at risks in these 4 domains: the domain of characteristics of the primary caregiver or the parent, the characteristics of the child, something about what's the relationship like between that child and caring adults that are available to them. And I like to know something about the context. Are there risks or protective factors in the environment that we can use or take advantage of or change that will help improve outcomes for that child? So we're going to start just looking, for example, at the child. These are the things I want to know about kids when I'm getting involved. And this is tiny babies as well as older children. I'd like to know a little bit about their temperament. Are they children who like novelty? Are they children who are shy? Are they slow to warm up? Are they gregarious, friendly children? Are they easy to engage? Are they children who naturally draw people to them? Or are they children that are off-putting in some way that people find difficult to be around? It's always helpful, of course, to know their prenatal and early history, something about their health. Then mind reading. Does anybody know what mind reading refers to for young babies? We're talking about children even under 1 year old. So the research is telling us that even very, very young children will start mind reading fairly quickly. And what I mean by that, this is how I explain it to parents, because mind reading is something they can remember. Young babies even very quickly begin to think about the intentions and the motives of other people as separate from their own. So even tiny babies understand that what you are thinking and what you are feeling might be different from themselves. And there's a series of brilliant experiments Andy Meltzoff and others have done just looking at and testing for this mind reading capacity in young children. It's an important social skill to be able to think about what's in the minds of other people. If you can't do that, it's very hard to have empathy for other people. It's hard to anticipate how your behavior is going to affect other people. It's hard to figure out what kind of response you're going to get from a teacher if you behave in a certain way, if you can't get yourself to think about what is in the mind of that other person. So mind reading is an important skill, and it starts early. One of the best ways that we know babies are starting to mind read, when they start pointing. And why is that telling us? Any thoughts from the room? Anybody want to take a stab at why is pointing telling us something about that baby's ability to mind read? Oh, you guys thought you were just going to sit here. Anybody want to give a... Yeah. Yes, exactly. I'll repeat that. So the baby knows that you will know what they're thinking about if they're pointing. So pointing is telling us that that baby has figured out that what's in your mind and what's in their mind is different. And if they want to share something with you, if they want you to enjoy something that they're enjoying, you have to be looking at it too. It's not enough for them to look at it, right? So pointing is telling us babies are starting to mind read. The next thing they start to do is what we call the triangle. And again, I like explaining it that way to parents because it's simple language. Speech pathologists will refer to this as triadic communication. You'll hear other ways of explaining it, but I like just saying it's the triangle. So babies, when they're first born, it's just me and I'm part of this universe and we're all one, right? Babies are just one with the universe. Pretty soon they start figuring out there's you and me. So they're very interested in mom's face and will really start drinking in the facial expressions and make eye contact. But shortly after that, there'll be you and me and something we're going to share together. That's where pointing starts, and then pretty soon it becomes joint attention and joint play. So that's when babies are starting to not only want you to look at things, but play with them with something, with blocks or a doll or something they're interested in. And this is, again, the serve and return that's now getting a little bit more sophisticated. So it's no longer just the cooing and babbling going back and forth. Now it's you and me and something I want you to share with me, a ball, a toy, a truck, something like that. So that's what we want to watch for is this child initiating? And are they interested in joint attention kinds of activities where it's you and me and something we're going to do together? So when I'm observing parents and children interacting, that's what I'm watching for. And then, of course, the executive functioning, that comes a little bit later. And I think we talked about this in the little video you saw up front, the air traffic control. So that's working memory, the ability to suppress impulses, those kinds of activities, the executive function activities. And I'm looking for how much, as children get a little bit older, I'm interested in, do they have a good air traffic controller? Are they able to focus their attention, suppress their impulsive behavior? Are they able to use their working memory, tell a coherent story, those kinds of things? All of those are disrupted with trauma, and you will see it in parents too. I'm going to get into that in a second. So with parents, what I'm interested in is, first of all, I really want to know their own history of trauma. And one of the biggest clues I get of a trauma history in parents is the working memory has been damaged. It's highly sensitive to stress and stress hormones. So the working memory, when you have someone who's been chronically traumatized in early childhood, they have a lot of different memory problems. You've probably seen this in many of your own families and clients who've had this history of trauma. And the way you see it, they cannot tell you a coherent story. And it's almost invariable that when I see an individual who can't tell me a story that goes from the beginning, the middle to the end, who has a lot of trouble organizing their thoughts, has a lot of trouble getting to the point, staying on topic. Often their chronology is very confusing. They'll talk about things that happened 10 years ago as if they just happened. They'll refer to people that have long since passed away as if they're still here. So you get this confusing chronology. It's very difficult. I usually find if I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out a narrative, usually it's trauma. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in their mindset. How do they think about this child? And we're going to talk about that in a second, how I go about figuring out what their mindset is. So you're looking at what was your past experience with your own upbringing and your future, your child. You're thinking about your child. Both are really important. In terms of the context, I want to know something about the context, about stress, other adversity, other resources, sources of support. Some very interesting research that I found shows that you can actually improve attachment security by reducing household stress. So studies that have been done on children, I think 12 months and 18 months, where they were able to change the level of stress in the household. They also were able to change the quality of the attachment between that child and parent. So we think a lot about, again, attachment therapy or other mental health interventions. Sometimes all you can do is reduce the stress in the household, and that might mean things like helping them with adequate housing, helping them with employment, helping them with childcare, transportation, all those very basic casework skills and tasks can often actually be as effective or more effective than a lot of our attachment interventions. And of course, I want to know something about the relationship. So we're looking at the parent and the child. What is the context surrounding that parent-child? What is the behavior of the parent-child? I'm looking for two things in particular. One is the child able to use that caregiver to help them regulate their stress response? So Are they able to get calm with the help of the caregiver, or do they turn to the caregiver for help when they're upset? Does the parent respond? And the other thing I'm looking for is serve and return. Is there lots of initiation from the child and responses from the parent? Are they working together? Are they attuned to one another? Is there a sense of, sometimes with mothers and babies or fathers and babies, it's almost like you're listening in or dropping in on a private conversation when you watch them together. So there's lots and lots of serve and return happening. And with some parents, there's very little. So I'm interested in knowing that about the relationship. Now I'm just going to share with you how I go about understanding something about parents' mindset towards their child. I did some training down in the States with the working model of the child interview, and I have found it very helpful. I'm using it on almost every clinical assessment that I do. I'm doing the working model of the child interview. Now, it's expensive. You have to usually travel somewhere, and there's a cost attached, and it's 5 days of intensive training. So I'm not necessarily recommending that everyone go and learn the working model of the child interview, but I wanted to share with you some of the questions that you can use to probe or inquire about how is this person thinking about their child. And some of the questions on the interview I think anyone could ask. And just learn and get some insight into how parents what's their mindset towards this child. So I will ask, how would you describe your child's personality? Can you tell me a story about why you said that? So parents will say, oh, he's very loving, he's sweet, he's kind. Well, tell me a story about a time when he was like that would help me see why you describe him that way. And very quickly you will get to know, how well does this parent actually know this child? How much do they think about this child? Do they have a negative or positive view of this child? Who does the child remind you of? If they remind you of somebody that you despise, oh, he reminds me of his dad, and his dad is somebody the mother totally despises, has no contact with, that's important information. Or he reminds me of my dad and I had a great relationship, he looks like him and he acts like him. That's a very different, you get a very different mindset from that, don't you? Very quickly. I often ask about difficult behaviors. What behavior do you find the most difficult? And can you give me an example? You see how all these questions are looking for examples. So it's not just tell me about it, but tell me a story about it. Often I ask, it's not on here, but I do often ask, tell me a story about a time when your child was hurt, ill, or upset, and what you did and what your child did. And that can give you a sense of how good they are at recognizing when their child is in distress and helping regulate that stress response. This is a very revealing question. Along with behavior is, do you think he or she knows that that bothers you, and why do you think he does it? I have found some very revealing responses to that question when asked about a problem behavior. One mom I was talking to with a 3-year-old child, she said the behavior that was bothering her the most was that the 3-year-old was always getting into the cleaning supplies under the sink. 3. And I said, do you think she knows that bothers you? And she said, oh, absolutely she knows that bothers me. Well, why do you think she does it? She does it to bug me. Well, that's a very different mindset and a very different set of strategies for intervening with that mindset than someone who has a different narrative to tell. And this one I have found really revealing. Do you have a favorite story that you like to tell friends or family about your child? When I did the training, one of the videos they showed when we were doing the training on this interview was a mom who had a huge history of trauma, and she described her favorite story was a story where the child actually killed a puppy. Like, seriously, and I mean, this was her favorite story to tell. So you can see how distorted and disturbed that would be as your favorite story. When I was interviewing a foster mom about a foster child she had, I asked her this question, do you have a favorite story you like to tell about Jimmy? And she'd had Jimmy in her home for quite a few years, and her response was, no, not really. So that tells me a little bit about how much space this child occupies in her mind. When you think of the child as an adult, what are your hopes and fears? People have often got a very strong narrative about how they see this child's life unfolding, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I find it very helpful to know what their image is and what their hopes and fears are. One mom I was talking to had a very clear narrative about her little, he was about 8 months old baby, that he was going to be a juvenile delinquent and be a very big problem and get into a lot of trouble when he was older. So again, it tells you something about their mindset. So now the working model of the child, when you do the training, they do talk about assessing you can learn to score these interviews in a reliable way. And again, I'm not recommending that you try to do that, but I do want to share with you some of the ways of thinking about parental mindset. So there's the balanced people who see the good, the bad, they're realistic. They have realistic developmental expectations. So the woman with the 3-year-old, her biggest problem was that the baby was getting into the cleaning supplies. Was that realistic to expect a 3-year-old wouldn't do that or would figure that out on their own? And the other thing is, do they feel they influence the child? So some parents you will find feel quite helpless. I don't know why she does it. I don't know. I've tried everything, nothing I can do. So you can see that they don't have a sense of agency. There's no sense that they have an influence over how this child is turning out. There's impoverished. I see this a lot in chronic neglect cases. I had one mom, 5 children, and they all sounded the same. You didn't get a sense that there was any distinct personalities, characteristics from any of those 5 children. They were just this kind of, you got the sense almost of this, this blob that was 5 children, and there was no sense that each of them had their own individual quirks or personalities. Role reversed, this is also common in child welfare, where the child, what you hear in terms of stories is stories of how the child is comforting the parent or serving the parent's needs. One mom that I talked to who was a severe alcoholic, and she described how this little child, she was only about 5, what she valued about her the most was that she made her feel better. She brought her tea when she was sick. So the child, this 5-year-old, was bringing cups of tea to mom when she was sick. And so that would be an example of role reversal, where you're seeing the child's value is really how they are meeting the needs of the parent. And sometimes it's role confused, where the child is really more of a peer, and you don't get a sense of a parent-child relationship. Or self-involved, I see this frequently. I do lots of work with high-conflict divorce, and I do see parents who are describing the child in very glowing terms, but it's a reflection on the parent. So the value the child has is that they reflect well on the parent. And I will often hear parents who are self-involved describe their child, and I'm not kidding, I've heard this probably half a dozen times. He's a mini me, he's a mini version of me. And that is how they see the child, as this mirror rather than as a distinct and separate person. So what I'm looking for in all of that is opportunities to intervene. So what I'm looking for is, where is their risk, where is their deficits, where are their strengths that I can exploit and take advantage of, and where can I change one of those risk factors that I've identified. And it can be a variety of ways. My message always is, every door should be the right door. I just really don't subscribe to the theory that I'm a specialist and I only treat, the left-handed Armenians. You have to be willing to be flexible and open and look for opportunities to intervene in risk factors wherever the opportunity arises. And that may mean negotiating, referring, brokering services, or doing something myself directly, but they can't be where we all have these very narrow silos and we only do our very specialized service and don't see ourselves as being interveners unless they meet a very specific set of criteria. Every intervention can be a mental health intervention as far as I'm concerned. So I just want to show you again, this is another little clip. It's a lovely little clip of a dad and his little baby. Some of you might have seen it before. And again, this is available for purchase if you think it's something you might like to use in your own agencies. And the reason I like this clip is because I like using positive role models for parents. So what the research is also saying is that starting with parental areas of strength, what are they doing well, and what can we get them doing more of, is better than focusing on deficits. And also showing positive role models of good parenting behavior as opposed to negative mistakes tends to have more resonance with parents when we're working with them. So this is one of my favorite clips to show parents. And this is a dad just talking about his little toddler, and the two of them are playing together in a park. And just watch for some of the things that we were just talking about in terms of serve and return. Do you see serve and return happening? What is this dad's mindset towards this child? Do you get a sense of how he would respond to the questions? Would this dad have stories to tell you about this child?
Let's go.
Let's go.
He's in this game these days where he's back and forth a lot. Like, he'll play going away. Hi.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. And he'll walk around the circle, and he gets real excited about coming back. He's been gone for 30 seconds, but it's like he's been gone for years. Hey, hi, that guy. I mean, it's a fun game for me to watch him step out into his world. He's so much more capable now than he was just a few months ago. He's able to tell me more about what he wants or what he needs, or if he's frustrated about something, he can tell me sometimes what it is, or closer. Or he could tell me, and sometimes I can understand. It's more like what it is. Oh, hi. Did you come back?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Can I wipe your nose again?
Yeah.
Thank you. It only takes a little bit, you know, that sort of refueling happens real quick, but it's sort of got to happen.
What do you mean refueling?
Well, like he runs down some sort of charge of being close to us, and then he comes back and he needs a little bit of recognition or just a touch. Or
On that rock.
yeah, you're high on that rock. He's pretty little, and it's a big world, and I can't blame him for wanting to stay somewhat close. But this balance between going out to explore and wanting to come back in and sort of, have the contact again.
Did anybody like watching this dad? Did that make you feel good? So what was it this dad was doing that makes us feel so good inside, that's so heartwarming to watch? And I'm just going to ask you guys to put your hands up and offer me some observations that you had, what you saw this dad doing that made you feel good about what you saw. Yes, and I'll repeat after you say it. He enjoyed his child. And what made you think he enjoyed his child? What was he doing that told you that? He was beaming. His face lit up when he was talking about him. And he was saying fairly positive things about his child, showing a lot of empathy for the child, right? Anything else? Yes, and I'll repeat again. He was paying a lot of attention to him. He was really thinking about what his child was trying to tell him. Yeah, he was putting a lot of effort into trying to understand his child's mindset, right? So this is a pre-verbal child, or a child that has a little bit of verbal skills, but not a lot. And he's really working hard to understand what it is his child is saying. So, Andy, I'm just going to go back to those working model of the child questions. So do you think this dad could describe his child's personality? Did he describe his child's personality just in that couple of minutes? Yeah, he said he's really trying hard to go out in the world. He wants to explore, and then he has to come back. And I think this dad could probably give us a few stories about his child. My guess is he would have many stories. I typically find that with typically developing parents and children, you can't stop them from telling you stories. They just have one story after another after another. In fact, the biggest problem they have is figuring out which favorite story to tell you, right? One dad I was talking to was burbling away about his son and being in the back of the truck. And he said, I drive him to work, or I drive him to the daycare before I go to work every day. And he always asks me, he always makes these inane comments, and then he ends it with, "Right, Dad?" And I said, "Well, like, for example, what?" And he said, well, he'll say, "That's a big building." Right, Dad? That's a cloud in the sky. Right, Dad? That's a blue truck. Right, Dad? And you could hear how much joy he was getting from this interaction with his son just in the back of his truck. And that would be a really good illustration of a parent who's got a very positive mindset, a very healthy attitude, and a very loving and positive relationship with their child. Do you think this fella could tell you what his story is of this child as an adult? My guess is this dad has a fairly positive view of how this child is going to turn out as an adult. I would also say to you that dad has not had a history of trauma, right? If he has, it isn't that people with trauma can never parent effectively, but it takes for many, many people with huge effort and the right set of circumstances, they can overcome these early traumas. But you will still see it in the way they tell their story, in the way they tell their narrative. Even parents who've healed and I think recovered nicely from very traumatic experiences, you will still kind of hear it in their story and the way they tell their narrative, that echo of trauma in the background. And again, this shouldn't be seen as hopeless. I've had this history of trauma, I can never be a good parent. That's not true. But being mindful of your history and how it is affecting the way you see the world and the way you are interacting with your child is enormously helpful. So that's the other thing I'm looking for is mindfulness. Was that dad pretty mindful, very conscious of his impact on this child? Do you think he had a sense of agency, that he was actually having some influence over the child? I believe so. So for traumatized children, we know that they have 3 critical issues, and these are talked about. The person who's done a nice job of summing this up is Mary Dozier, who's got many, many papers and articles on intervening with traumatized infants in foster care particularly. But the 3 critical issues that she identified, and I agree with, is first, they just can't regulate their attention, their behavior, appetite, sleep, wake, as we expect, and this is frequently heard from foster parents as major concerns, that they're up in the night, they're wandering. Part of the problem that foster parents have or caregivers have with these children who've had this traumatized experience is they don't react the way that little boy did in the video we just watched. These children, rather than going out and coming back, they just go out and go out and go out, and they don't come back, right? They don't give very good cues. They're puzzling to understand. That little boy in the video, it was pretty clear what he was interested in, what he wanted, what he was enjoying, what he felt good about. With traumatized children, their cues are often quite puzzling. And often these children are provoking negative responses from caregivers. So what you'll see with a traumatized child is, rather than that smooth back and forth that was going on with that dad and his little boy, with traumatized children, even if they have healthy caregivers, often it's no, don't, you can't, come back, and often you don't get that sense of a smooth, fluid attunement going on between them. So you get very negative responses from teachers, from peers, from caregivers. So what we're doing when we intervene with parents who have had a lot of trauma and their children is we're helping them build a new kind of a relationship with that child. The way that we're doing it is by looking at those 4 domains: parent, child, relationship, and context. And this set of strategies is really around the relationship domain, trying to build a better relationship. So what we do, and this is in many different types of interventions, is just break down behaviorally what's going on, that serve and return. So what you want the parent to do is recognize the serve or the cue that the child is giving. So you want them to read the cue, recognize the child is actually serving you something. You want them to interpret it correctly, and then you want them to respond contingently. You want them to respond appropriately to the cue the child is giving them. So often the work that I'm doing with parents and children is, especially with the infants, very young preverbal children, is just basic cue reading. What's the baby trying to tell you? What do you think the baby is thinking about? How do you think the baby is enjoying that? Do you think the baby likes that? Oh, look, your baby is smiling. I think your baby's trying to tell you she really wants more of that or wants to do more of that. That kind of basic cue reading. Showing affection and empathy. Some parents really just don't know how to show affection and empathy. They've had no experience with it themselves, and they really need help understanding how to do that. Watching facial expression and matching their arousal to that of the child. So watching when the child is excited about something, mirroring that excitement, being joyful with the child. When the child is upset, recognizing the child is upset and mirroring a response, an empathetic response. Eye contact. Often I'm at the very basic level of teaching parents just to work at making eye contact, because many of these children are not used to eye contact, so they're not looking for it. So often what you have to do is really help the parent catch the child making eye contact and give a big response to that. So face lights up. When your baby actually glances at you, respond. Big smile. Engage, right? And gestures and vocalizations, that triangle, really helping parents learn how to engage in a joint activity with their child. There's lots of great resources to help you with this. One in particular is called the Talk Box. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It was developed by a couple of speech therapists here in Alberta, and I think it's going all over the world because it's so terrific. It's just a series of cards. You can print them off yourself or you can order them. And they're like little recipe cards with toys on them and ideas for parents on different joint activities they can use that toy to engage their child with. So they'll have, for example, a ball, and then they'll have some ideas for parents on how to use a ball to get that child engaged in a joint activity and to promote language. When you're promoting language, you're promoting a relationship. You're promoting that serve and return. Language is serve and return, right? So you'll find a lot of stuff that speech therapists use to promote language is also helpful for promoting mental health and for promoting positive relationships. That's just one. There are many others. So when you're targeting these 3 critical needs for traumatized children, there's this huge and increasing gap between what we expect of these children and what they can deliver in the way of behavior. And they don't have the neural pathways for self-regulation to manage those behaviors and emotions. So many of the traditional techniques that we have for handling sleep, food, or behavior problems, things like using timeouts, ignoring negative behaviors, withdrawing privileges, letting them cry it out, for the traumatized parent and child, it can actually make things worse. And this is a big problem for our child welfare folks who are often sending parents to parenting classes that are really not meant for traumatized children and parents. So we have to be really aware of that and cognizant of what we're expecting from parents when we send them off to parenting classes, that it's actually designed for the type of child that they have and for their particular circumstances. Because often parenting skills training is meant for parents who are not particularly traumatized. It's meant for parents who have a pretty good relationship with their child but are struggling with a specific or particular behavior problems. But it isn't really intended or designed for parents who have significant trauma and have a child who has been traumatized as well. So one way that I help parents understand it, and foster parents, preschool teachers, whoever it is that I'm talking to or advocating on behalf of a child for, that there's a difference between a developmental problem and a behavior problem, and understanding that difference is really helpful in terms of understanding how you're going to intervene. So when kids are making developmental mistakes, we tend to be much more sympathetic. So a child who can't walk, we don't really give them a timeout, do we? That would not be appropriate. So a child who can't self-regulate is no different. Think of it, these kinds of behavioral meltdowns that these kids have, think of it almost like a seizure. They just are not in control of that. And it's not that different from having a seizure. And we don't put a child in timeouts for that, or we don't discipline them for that. What we try to do is assume they're trying to make the correct response and support them for it. We assume that errors are accidental. When children fall down because they're learning to walk, we don't assume they're doing that on purpose. Learning needs exploration, and children need extra support if they can't meet the developmental task. But when it comes to behavior, we take a very different approach. We assume they're trying to be disruptive, their behavior is purposeful, deliberate, they should learn to obey, and if they don't, they need discipline. There's a very different attitude when it's in the behavioral realm as opposed to other developmental problems. So the way that I think about intervention is, I think I talked about this last time, the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, or the rider and the elephant is another way I explain it to parents. So children who can't self-regulate means that the rider fell off the elephant. Sometimes they get into these temper tantrums and the elephant has gone charging down the path, the rider is no longer in control. There is no use talking to the elephant if the rider has fallen off. There's no point, right? So that's how I explain to parents the problem with saying things like, well, now why did you do that, Johnny? And are you sorry? Do you something you want to say to your sister? If the rider and the elephant have lost each other and that elephant has gone charging down a path, there's no use talking to the elephant. You have to calm them down. And that's your job, is to co-regulate, to help them learn those self-regulation skills that they've been missing. So you want to reduce the expectations on them. And the way that I do that very quickly is to tell parents or caregivers, whoever it is I'm talking to, treat them as a much younger child. I had one adoptive mom, I said to her, treat this, I think the child was 3 or 4, I said, treat her like an 8-month-old. Like, just treat her like an 8-month-old, and that just immediately globally reduced the expectations. Make their world smaller, have fewer distractions, challenges, difficulties. Get rid of clutter, keep the place calm, get rid of the TV or at least turn it off. Make their world smaller in terms of be more available physically for supervision, and manage that environment. I recommend time-ins as opposed to time-outs, and these actually work. I've tried it with my own kids and it's an effective strategy. So two kids are fighting over a truck. Instead of saying, okay, I'm taking away the truck, you can each go sit in the corner until you're ready to play nicely, you move in and say, you know what, you guys are having trouble. How about the 3 of us play together for a little while until you feel better? And so you want to take charge. And I always say give them what they need, well, not what they deserve. And by that I mean they need supervision and help. Now you may think they deserve a timeout, but what you want to do is respond to the need, not what you think they deserve. Move in closer, engage the child in a positive interaction. So often what happens is parents go in and they intervene with the negative behavior, but they don't stay around long enough to engage the child in a positive interaction. And the reason you want to do that is because engaging a child in a positive interaction is helping them regulate their emotions. So by joint attention and joint engagement, you're actually helping them learn how to self-regulate. And you want to give them the verbal message, I see you're upset, I'm going to help you. Your tone of voice and your facial expression, because their language is probably shut down when they're upset or tantruming. So what they're actually paying attention to is your face and your voice, not your words. So watch the face and voice and the nonverbal messages. So parents can help children through joint attention and engagement. Don't let them go on automatic pilot all the time. This is what traumatized children will do, is they'll be inclined to just kind of go on automatic pilot. They zone out. And you'll see this with parents as well. So you want to help them stay with you, stay engaged, and the easiest way to do that is joint attention. I often find this is a good strategy for helping parents of older children with homework problems, is joint attention, being there at the table with them, not expecting them to go off and do their homework on their own. Touch. Our children in foster care are touch deprived, and there's lots of research on the incredibly therapeutic effects of just having physical contact with others. Again, it's part of what we were meant for. We're herding animals. We want to be in physical contact with one another, and children who don't have positive physical contact with other people have a harder time self-regulating. Let's take a rest is a strategy that I've used many times with parents. It's a cue for the child when they're escalating and having trouble starting to get out of control in terms of motor activity or in some other way, is breaking it with let's take a rest cue, and that means let's go read a book or play with puppets or blow bubbles or do something that's engaging for the child as a way of breaking that escalating cycle. So what you'll see with children, normally developing children, is they go through these periods of arousal and periods of calm, arousal, calm, and they're sort of working towards the end of the day when they should be calming down and getting ready for sleep. Traumatized children aren't like that. Often they are hypo or hyper responsive. So some children just have flat affect all day long. Other children tend to get into these states of very high arousal and then they crash, high arousal and crash. And that's what you're trying to break up when you say, let's take a rest, is you want to smooth that out. So you see them going into that state of arousal and you want to bring them back down again. And it's good to have in mind some strategies of really engaging activities you know that child likes, so that you can use them at those moments where you see they're escalating. I'm not going to get into some of these other strategies except to say a really good book is Dan Siegel's new book, The Whole Brain Child. He has lots of great strategies. And another good book is Ellen Galinsky's Minds in the Making. It's got lots and lots of strategies on how to help children who have these areas of deficits. Aspirin in the orange juice is one I will mention, and that is sometimes you need to sneak in the therapy without the child necessarily knowing what you're doing. So for children who are somewhat touch avoidant, sometimes things like this little piggy or other games where you're touching can be a nice way of introducing touch to that child. I'm just going to share this little cartoon with you, and I know you're all going to want it. I got it from comics.com, I think, and it's A Rose is a Rose is the name of the cartoon. And if you go to their website, A Rose is a Rose, they have different topic categories. This one is under parenting. And I think this is just a brilliant sample of what children really need, and it really captures attachment theory, I think, in one little cartoon. So you see this little guy with the depleted power cells. And there's Dad, the recharger, in the big armchair with his arms open, saying, you are welcome. You can come to me when you are upset. I will welcome that. Some parents push children away when they're upset and they're only welcome when they're happy, right? Other parents are, your children aren't welcome anytime. But this dad is saying, it's okay that you're upset and I will help you with it. And there he is, big recharger. This is what children really need, is getting that recharge when they're upset and they're down and they're in the dumps. And the next thing that you'll see in parents and children who are developing well and healthy is what I call, this will be very familiar to any of you who've had a toddler on your lap, the full charge indicator wiggle. So you can see there, this little guy is just letting his dad know, hey, I'm ready to go again. And what you get then is the fully charged cells that are capable of anything. That is what children really need. If you can do that, this is the message of hope that I try to give to traumatized parents or parents who are really struggling. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do that all the time. But if you can do that most of the time, I'm not saying you won't have issues and struggles, but you will muddle through. Your children will muddle through one way or the other if you can do that most of the time. Just be that source of comfort and recognize when your children need to come to you, need to get that big recharging, and if you recognize when they're ready to explore and see the world again, and let them go. Most parents, if they can do that most of the time, life might not be perfect, but you'll probably be okay. And it's a doable task, I think, for most parents. They can manage it. So that's kind of the downstairs brain. And now for the upstairs brain, this is for the rider. And this is, remember I was saying, around trauma, and it affects working memory. And it affects that air traffic controller, the executive functioning skills. And again, this is from Ellen Galinsky. She has lots of these strategies. Working memory, you can help children improve their working memory. You just need to focus on it a little bit through things like games, memory games, games that have rules, matching games. One of the strategies, and this is from Dan Siegel's book, and I really liked it, and I've used it a lot with foster parents, is remember to remember. So what he's referring to is remember to go over the day or the week with a child. At dinner time, you might say, so tell me about your day. You started in the morning where you couldn't make up your mind what you were going to wear, and I think you ended up picking your black outfit. What happened next? Well, you went to school, and how was your first period? What did you do? Oh, you had biology. So how did that go? Just remembering to walk through the day, because a lot of traumatized children don't do that. And it's their working memory is impaired, and just helping them recall and recollect and review their day is a way of helping them put together a coherent story, to be able to tell a coherent story about themselves. And for children who are in foster care and experiencing a lot of disruption, this is especially important. I often suggest to parents who are divorced, even a very, very young children, that they start a storybook that goes back and forth between a separated couple that has pictures of the child going through their day in each of the households as a way of helping the child keep the other parent in mind during separations. It's also a way of helping the child tell a coherent story. Oops, sorry. So I notice we're at 11:50. Do we want to open up for questions?
I actually have several questions from the
Okay.
web.
Okay.
So we'll start with Vicky. And don't worry, for people in the room, if you just shoot your hand up, I'm happy to come over and see you. Vicky asked, where can traumatized parents go for parenting classes that are appropriate for their experience?
Well, that is a very good question, Vicki. I am not sure. Usually what I end up doing is just modifying parenting strategies myself. I'm not really that familiar with parenting classes that are specifically designed for traumatized people. More likely you're going to find them with agencies that are typically dealing with child welfare populations. So I'm going to guess agencies such as McMahon, and I'm looking at you. Would McMahon be a place you could go for more? So I'm hearing from someone who's from McMahon who's saying through their parenting support program that although she's not that familiar with the specific content, her feeling is they're more likely designed more specifically for traumatized parents. If you're in one of the urban centers, you can go to the mental health services and ask about parenting programs as well. What I'm finding that I do a lot in my practice is modify strategies just exactly like I've described to you and work with parents one-on-one. And some practitioners may be willing to do that in group formats as well, and I'm guessing some of this agencies like McMahon and others that see a lot of these children and families would be more likely to start doing that than others. But as long as you're, I think, looking at these strategies and helping parents understand the difference between what's likely to work for a healthy developing child who's never had any significant trauma versus children who just haven't developed those self-regulation skills and really can't. It's not that they won't, it's that they can't, right?
And Evelyn, I was just going to add that if someone goes to the Alberta Human Services website, if you go and you enter in a search for parent link centers, there are a number of specialized parent link centers that do actually provide this type of support.
Oh, excellent. I did not know that. Perfect.
And so now a question from Wendy from the webcast. How can we be more mindful of the needs of traumatized adults when they are in a group session or a program? And then maybe building on that, how can we support traumatized children who have sensory integration issues?
Oh, sensory integration is a whole area of practice, and the people that I refer to and rely upon when it comes to sensory integration are OTs, and usually they're available through the public health units or the children's hospitals, those kinds of programs and services. What was the first part of that question again about just how can we
Oh,
support?
the first part was how can we be more mindful of the needs of traumatized adults when they're in a group session or program?
When they're in a group, because the trauma is coming out in their inability to regulate. Usually what I used to do when I ran a lot of groups, where I used to run a lot of groups at the Glenrose Hospital when I lived here in Edmonton and worked there. And occasionally you would have traumatized people in those groups. And what I often found would happen is that their inability to regulate themselves would distress the other members of the group. And so usually what I would try to do is single them out and address their issues in a separate forum. So giving the message to the group that this person will be cared for and supported, and giving the message to the person that this isn't a good time for us to be addressing this particular concern, and you need more support and help than I can give you in this format, but we'll meet after and talk some more. So I've found that otherwise what happens is you either end up diverting the whole group to that one traumatized person, or you really upset everybody else in the group because of that person's trauma. So the other way to handle that also is to screen for trauma before you select members for your group, so that you know what you're getting. I mean, if that's your intent to offer a group for traumatized parents, that's one thing. But if you're trying to offer a group for something different and there's traumatized people in it, it can divert your agenda for the rest of your group. So screening, and then if you have missed somebody and they got in there anyway and you're finding that it's diverting the agenda for your group, I usually do try to give a very strong message. You need lots more attention than I can give you in this context, so let's talk about that at another time. And make sure everybody in the group knows you're going to take care of them.
Does anyone have any questions in the room before I go to another webcast question?
Hi, I was just wondering, with regard to training, you mentioned that you train like a lot of the supervisors and supports in children's services. What is being done to address the actual foster parents who are dealing with these issues?
Well, I do lots of foster parent training in Calgary. I'm not as familiar with what's going on in other areas, but I do believe there is a lot actually in the core training around trauma, and I'm wondering, would you like to speak to that at all? I don't want to put you on the spot, but oh, maybe just wait for the mic.
I do believe there is a specific module.
There's a module in the core training around trauma.
And often that can certainly be a focus of additional or specialized training. But certainly one of the resources we could put up is what's available for foster parents through either the ministry or the Foster Parent Association. Maybe this lady back there knows.
No? Anyway, sorry, did you catch that okay? Did everyone hear that? So in Calgary, what I'm doing is some extra training, so it would be more the specialized training, and the one that I'm doing I call Fostering the Whole Brain, and based it on Dan Siegel's book, The Whole Brain Child. So what I would do if I didn't have any specialized resources in the community and you have foster parents looking for that, I would direct them to that book. It really is meant, Dan Siegel his focus really is on trauma and mindfulness, and I found it a very useful book. Most of the foster parents, I think, after I did 2 sessions around that book, and I think most of them ended up purchasing it. It's just got lots of good strategies in it. Does that help? Not sure.
I have a question, because within our program we get parents sent from Child Welfare Services that they need to take a program, and so that screening as to for a parenting program, and I'm just wondering what for the people making those referrals, what sort of assessment they're doing so that they're referring parents to the right sort of parenting program.
Well, I would say if you're getting lots of referrals of traumatized people, I would try to account for that in the way I was delivering the training as well, because a lot of strategies that work for lots of parents can be modified for traumatized parents. It's just you have to know they're there, right? So I'm not sure if I'm helping, or you're wondering about screening or assessment?
Well, it's just that sometimes we get people the clients who are coming to us just say, my caseworker said I needed to take a program. And that's sort of the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And then as we discover, and most of our clients are Aboriginal clients, so there's And we do some assessment of talking about why they're there and some of their history, but by and large, the majority of them have some sort of trauma.
For sure.
And so we're just accepting that as a given, that we're dealing with traumatized parents. And it is, and I was really intrigued about, and thankful for you mentioning that most of our parenting programs need to be modified for these parents, because we've been thinking of doing it more, rather than a parenting program, to have one-to-one support. And I just would like you to know, like, are we on the right track?
It is, and I would even say you could do a combination of the two, where you do some things as a group and some things with individuals, one-on-one. And there was something that I wanted to say about that, but it has slipped my mind. Sorry, was there another question in there? But yes, I do. I agree that you could do a combination of individual and group. But I would be really aware that if you're getting a lot of traumatized people, that you... Oh, I know what I was going to say. If you're a child welfare worker and you're referring people to a parenting group, sometimes the parenting group might miss the boat because it's not designed for somebody who's traumatized, and to not necessarily see that as a mark against the parent. So sometimes for parents it can be a challenge, right? Sorry, you're holding up your hand. Another question?
I have another question from the web. Actually, a couple of questions that have been similar in nature have come in, but I'll read this one from Elizabeth, who says, what suggestions would you make for daycare staff who are working with families and children who are exhibiting many of these behaviors, but the parent is not willing to acknowledge or cooperate? And one person said, what if the parent doesn't acknowledge their own trauma and blames the traumatized child?
You have to get really good at telling the core story that we went over the last session that I did. So you have to be able...
Which, by the way, people can actually view on the website that will be emailed out to everyone following this session. So the links to your first session, where people can watch it, will be emailed out to everyone who has attended this session, so that they can watch what you're referring to if they missed it.
And we only have a 1 minute left, so I just want, I believe anyway, am I right? 11:59. So I just want to say that, what was the question again? I'm losing my... Oh, daycare, about daycare. Yeah, you get really good at telling that core story to help parents understand how their child development is happening. What is the baby's job? How are they doing it? They're doing it through their relationship with you, this serve and return. How is it getting derailed? And what are we going to do to help this child? So if you get really good at that core story, it makes it much easier for parents to embrace the idea of change. When you can't do that, what you want to do then is try to provide a substitute competent caregiver for that child to do serve and return with, somewhere like in the child care program itself or elsewhere in that child's life. So if parent can't do it, is there someone else in that child's life that can be that serve and return, that secure base, that person that modifies or modulates, provides that co-regulation? So that's what you want to look for. Substitute person or engaging that parent in the core story, one of those two. Does that make sense? And 60 seconds isn't a long time, because that's another whole lecture, but that's where I would start. And also making sure your childcare staff are familiar with the core story so that they understand the impact they're having when they do the serve and return with the children that they're caring for. Kids spend a lot of time in childcare, and they need an attachment partner or a serve and return partner who can be helping them co-regulate and offering that stimulation, supporting that development as well.
You know what? I think it's okay if we take one more question.
Okay.
How do you tell the difference between trauma and brain injury like FASD, because they have very similar presentations?
I don't care that much whether it's specifically trauma or other kinds of brain. It's often the strategies are exactly the same. And I would say too that the research I've been looking at, and I just can't think of the name of the author, Connor or O'Connor, but he was suggesting that much of what we've been attributing to prenatal exposure to alcohol is actually a combination of prenatal exposure and postnatal poor care. So children who've had that prenatal exposure followed by a period of neglect, often you will see much more damaging outcomes than children who've only had prenatal exposure without the other damaging effects. And there's programs, I think, in Vancouver where they're actually providing nutrition and other opportunities for women who are active users, and they're getting much better outcomes for the kids. So sometimes it's not just the alcohol, but the poor nutrition, the stress, and all that prenatal experience that's actually the problem. So very often, even with active users who are pregnant, if we can provide them with supports and opportunities to get adequate nutrition and good housing and so on, we can do a lot to protect the babies, even with just that. Does that? But in terms of telling the difference, I often don't, it doesn't matter to me. I look at what I've got in front of me, and many of these strategies are effective no matter what. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And perhaps on behalf of the large web audience, Webland I called them, as well as the local audience, we'd like to thank you, Evelyn, for that very informative session. So on behalf of the group here, thank you. So just a couple reminders before we wrap up, and some of you may log off, that the presentation has been recorded. It is available online and on the website, and those interested who missed the first session that Evelyn provided, the core story, that will be emailed as well. Reminder about the certificate with respect to attendance will be emailed along with the evaluation, so we do encourage you to complete the evaluation because that provides very useful information for planning for future sessions. General reminder, the next session in this Children's Mental Health Learning Series will take place in Calgary, and the session will be Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. There will be more information on the website, so if you've signed up to get the information emailed to you, you'll get that reminder. And also your presentation will be available along with that, correct, Evelyn? And any of some of the resources that you talked about, that would be, I think, very appreciated. Some of the books and references would be great to hear.
I just recommend people go to my website.
Okay, and do we have your website is linked there as well?
If you just Google my name, you'll come to my website.
Okay, there you go.
And I don't know if everybody heard that on the web.
I can assure everyone that every link to every resource and your PowerPoint presentations and recording links will all be emailed out tomorrow, along with the link to the evaluation that you have to fill out if you want your certificate of attendance. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy, and a link to Evelyn's website. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon.